A flight attendant refused a black CEO's brother a blanket, but that very blanket later became part of a lesson in respect the entire cabin would remember. He punched the black CEO's brother for asking a blanket, thinking no one would intervene. He didn't realize that same blanket would soon deliver justice in the harshest way. Subscribe if you believe cruelty always comes back wrapped in consequences. Can I ask for a blanket before we take off? Laurent's voice was soft, hopeful, not the kind that usually drew tension. Yet the moment the words left his mouth, something in the cabin seemed to stall. Darian Vale glanced up from his tablet, barely lifting his chin. He didn't need to say anything, just nodded once. That was all Laurent needed. But the man approaching their row didn't move with the rhythm of calm service. The flight attendant, broad-shouldered, tightly groomed with a name tag that read Corvin, maneuvered the cart down the narrow aisle like it was a siege engine. His hands gripped the handlebar too tightly, his jaw visibly clenched even from a few seats away. Darian's gaze sharpened. He had seen men like this before, rigid on the outside, chaotic within. Corvin hadn't even reached their row yet, and he had already exchanged terse words with a man in 14A over carry-on storage and shot a glare at a young boy kicking his tray table. There was an edge to him that didn't belong at cruising altitude. When Corvin finally stopped at their row, the cart jerked slightly as if reacting to the tension inside its handler. His eyes met Laurent's, not with the neutrality of a professional, but with something cooler, dismissive, already on guard. The request hadn't even been made yet, but the tone was already set. "Excuse me, sir," Laurent said, offering a polite smile. "Would it be possible to get a blanket? Just—" Corvin didn't blink. His lips thinned as if tasting something sour. He said nothing, not a word, just stood there, hand still curled around the cart handle like he might crush it. Laurent blinked, unsure if he hadn't been heard. He glanced at Darian, a brief flick of the eyes that asked silently, "Did I do something wrong?" Darian gave the slightest shake of the head. "No, you didn't." "The blankets," Laurent tried again, more hesitant this time. "If there's one available?" Still no response. But something shifted. Corvin's nostrils flared slightly. He didn't speak, didn't reach for the neatly folded blue blanket that sat right atop the cart, untouched, visible, undeniable. Instead, he turned his head slightly, as if listening to a voice no one else could hear, then pushed the cart forward without a word, without looking back. Laurent sank slightly into his seat, confused but too gentle a soul to push. "Maybe he didn't hear me," he murmured. Darian didn't reply. He watched Corvin's retreating figure, the stiff, unyielding lines of his back, the clench of his shoulders. No turbulence yet, but something was off. The air in the cabin held still, too still. Other passengers, including the man in 14A, exchanged glances. One even leaned forward slightly, whispering, "He's been like that since we boarded." A quiet wave of awareness was forming, one row at a time. Corvin had made a choice, and it wasn't about a blanket. Darian turned his head, scanning the cabin, the lighting, the spacing, the people nearby. He filed the moment away, mentally time-stamping it, like he had done 1,000 times in high-stakes boardrooms. He didn't confront yet. Instead, he placed a steady hand on Laurent's arm. "It's okay," he said, but his voice was thoughtful, measuring. Laurent tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not a big deal. Just a blanket." "No," Darian replied softly, still watching the cart disappear down the aisle. "But sometimes small things show you everything." He could feel the pattern emerging, faint, still forming. Not enough yet to predict what would happen next, but enough to know something wasn't right. He glanced again at the blanket still sitting on the cart, as if it were a fuse waiting for someone to strike a match. Passengers were settling into the lull of pre-takeoff routines, reading safety cards, adjusting headrests, scrolling through in-flight menus. But Darian's senses stayed heightened. The scent of the cabin, faint citrus from the air vents, The low hum of the engines spooling up, the soft clicks of seatbelt latches, every detail was anchoring him in the present, warning him to stay alert. When Corvin passed by again a few minutes later, his eyes brushed over Darien and Laurent like a searchlight scanning a perimeter. He said nothing, but the corners of his mouth twitched. Not quite a frown, not quite a smile. Just tension masquerading as control. Darien folded his hands. The moment would pass, he thought, or it would escalate. Either way, he would be ready. He didn't know yet what shape the storm would take, but the pressure in the air felt familiar. He had walked into enough corporate ambushes to know the signs. The silence before, the invisible signals exchanged in body language, the way certain men walked like they were already preparing to defend themselves, even when no one had raised a hand. Laurent rubbed his hands together for warmth, then pulled his hoodie a little tighter. "Guess I'll be fine without it." But the blanket still sat on that cart, untouched, waiting. And Darien could feel the beginning of a conflict taking shape, even if he didn't know its shape yet. Corvin Haldor reappeared in the aisle like a returning storm cloud, jaw locked, shoulders square, and eyes already narrowed, as if the decision to escalate had been made long before his feet carried him back. His grip on the service cart was tighter this time. Fingers curled white against the metal as he steered it down the narrow path. The cart rattled faintly, a jitter that mirrored something simmering beneath his controlled exterior. Laurent, still seated, glanced toward his brother for reassurance, then turned to Corvin with a polite tone, softer now, but still steady. "Excuse me. May I please have that blanket now?" Corvin didn't hesitate. "They're reserved," he snapped, each word clipped, mechanical. The blanket in question, clearly visible in the top rack of the cart, sat untouched. It wasn't reserved, it was ignored. His tone wasn't one of explanation, but accusation, as though Laren's request had broken some unspoken rule. The cabin, already hushed from the earlier encounter, grew even quieter. Passengers leaning in, brows raised, breaths held. They had heard Laurent ask before. They had seen Corvin walk away. Darien kept his posture relaxed but alert. Behind his calm eyes, his mind flicked through patterns he'd learned after years of boardroom warfare. The tone of a man looking for confrontation. The body language of someone trying to justify their own unraveling. Corvin wasn't reacting to Laurent. He was reacting to something else, and Laurent had simply become a target. Darien knew that look. He had seen it across long tables, behind expensive suits, from men who blamed others for their own chaos. A cough broke the silence. An older man across the aisle, bald with a light blue tie, leaned slightly forward and whispered just loud enough for nearby rows to hear. "This attendant's been agitated since boarding." The words floated like a warning bell no one in authority seemed willing to ring. Darien finally spoke, not forcefully, but with a clarity honed by years of holding power without raising his voice. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Corvin directly, "but are the blankets actually restricted, or is there a misunderstanding?" The question hung between them. Corvin turned his head slowly, locking eyes with Darien. His jaw twitched. "I'm not going to be commanded," he said, voice low but shaking, each syllable laced with something unsteady. "Not by passengers." Laurent raised both palms slightly, a placating gesture. "It's okay," he said gently. "I didn't mean—" "Don't," Corvin barked, cutting him off. He took a step forward, past the boundary of polite service, into the space between seats where personal space still mattered. "You think you're clever? Trying to provoke me twice." Darien subtly shifted his position, body angled slightly between Corvin and his brother, not aggressive, but unmistakably protective. He didn't speak, he calculated. How many witnesses? How many recording? He could already feel the shifting temperature of the cabin. Passengers were no longer passive observers. They were picking sides. Then it happened. Corven reached into the cart with sudden, almost theatrical force, yanking a folded blanket from the top rack as though it had weight. It flapped slightly in his hand, but instead of handing it over, he clutched it close to his chest like stolen evidence. "You wanted this to start something," Corven said, his voice now trembling at the edges. "And you're getting it." A passenger 2 rows back let out a low, "Whoa," under his breath. Another took out his phone. "You're accusing him of what, exactly?" Darien asked carefully, still calm, still watching. "Of asking for basic comfort?" Corven took another step closer, now looming directly above Laron. "You think I don't see the game? You've been testing me since boarding." Laron opened his mouth to reply but said nothing. He looked confused, not frightened yet, but bewildered by the sudden hostility. He had only asked for a blanket. Darien narrowed his eyes, tone dropping a shade colder. "You're out of line." The cabin was silent again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was electric. Every person nearby knew the flight had shifted. The friendly pre-takeoff energy was gone. A new atmosphere had taken over, one heavy with anticipation, the kind felt before things go wrong. Corven's breathing had changed. It was louder, more erratic. His free hand, still hanging at his side, twitched. He looked like someone waiting to be given permission to erupt, only he had given that permission to himself. And Laron, oblivious to how close the storm truly was, blinked once and said, "I just wanted a blanket, man." The words were soft, sincere, and somehow they triggered the sharpest silence of all. Corven's expression contorted. "Trying to provoke me," he repeated, louder now, for everyone to hear. "That's what this is." Someone near the back muttered, "Is he serious?" And Darien, feeling the pieces lock into place, realized what had just unfolded. The calm flight he expected had evaporated. What was once a simple request had become an accusation. What was once an ordinary interaction had become something deeply personal in the mind of a man who should never have had this much power on a plane. The moment hung frozen. The calm flight Darien expected was dissolving into something none of them were prepared for. Corven's fist struck Laron's face with a violent crack, a sharp, practiced blow that landed square across the bridge of the nose. The sound echoed louder than it should have in the tight cabin air, snapping through the murmurs and hum of the engine like a bone giving way. Laron's head jerked backward against the seat, and his body slumped sideways under the force. Blood burst instantly, pouring over his lips and dripping along his chin, warm and fast, staining the collar of his pale shirt. Gasps scattered across the cabin like dominoes falling. One passenger stood halfway, frozen in place. A child dropped his tablet. The boy in the back row, who had been silently recording, gripped his phone tighter, angling it instinctively toward the unfolding chaos. Corven stood over Laron, breathing heavily, his jaw clenched and his eyes wide, not in horror, but in denial, as if the force of his own actions surprised him. Darien didn't flinch. He didn't shout or panic. Instead, he reacted with the cold precision of a man who had seen too many boardroom betrayals, who knew the signs of someone crossing a line with no intention of stepping back. His hand moved swiftly to the service cart still parked beside their row. The same blanket Corven had earlier refused Laron now became a tool of urgency. Darien grabbed it without hesitation, pressed it gently to his brother's nose, and applied steady pressure to slow the bleeding. "Laron, stay with me," he said, his voice even, low. His other hand gripped Laron's shoulder, grounding him. Corven stepped back, his body trembling, eyes darting around the cabin as passengers began to rise. His lips moved silently at first, and then the denial spilled out. He provoked me," Corven stammered, gesturing vaguely as if the crowd would magically side with him. "You all saw it, right? He raised his hands. He was aggressive." But no one responded in his favor. Darien turned his gaze up slowly, fixing his eyes on Corven. "He was seated. You hit a seated man who asked for help." Corven's mouth opened, then shut. For a moment it looked like he might say something else, but nothing came out. A man in the aisle, mid-30s and broad-shouldered, stepped forward and pointed directly at the boy filming in the back. "You got that on video?" he asked. The boy nodded, raising his phone higher. "Every second." A ripple of approval moved through the cabin, subtle but powerful. Another man near the emergency row stood up and turned to Corvin. "You need to sit down before you make this worse for yourself." Darian adjusted the blanket, noting the saturation of blood beginning to soak through. Laron was conscious but breathing hard, his face pale. The pain etched deeply around his eyes, but he stayed still, trusting Darian to handle the moment. "Keep pressure," Darian whispered to him. "I've got the rest." Corvin's fists now hung limp at his sides, his fingers twitching as if unsure whether to clench or retreat. His posture was no longer confident or authoritative. It was defensive, shrinking. "I need the captain," someone shouted. "Now." Others echoed it. The chant built not in volume, but in shared insistence. Corvin's authority had evaporated. All that remained was a man standing alone, with every eye watching, every phone ready. Darian stood fully now, towering just enough over Corvin to make the distance between them a visible metaphor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "If you move toward him again," he said quietly, "I won't need to stop you." They will. Corvin looked around and saw the truth in Darian's words. Men were rising across the cabin. One had already moved to the aisle near the cockpit. Another was blocking the galley door behind them. The pilot hadn't emerged yet. Foreshadowing brewed in Darian's thoughts like a storm building behind glass. He knew the real danger wasn't just this moment, but the silence that might follow if the airline tried to cover it. He could already picture it. A vague announcement, a falsified report, a passenger altercation brushed away. Not this time. The blanket grew heavier in his hand, not with fabric, but with meaning. "Do you think anyone will believe passengers over crew?" Corvin asked suddenly, voice low and trembling, laced with misplaced confidence. It was a whisper, but a fatal one. From all corners of the cabin, phones lifted. Darian didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. And when a man near the front muttered under his breath, "They're gonna bury him with that footage," it wasn't a threat. It was a forecast. Corvin shifted back toward the galley, his breath shallow, eyes unfocused, but the aisle was already blocked by passengers who had quietly formed a line. Not aggressive, not physical, just unmovable. Darian leaned in closer to Laron, gently tilting his head to check for swelling. Laron winced, but nodded faintly. "I'm okay," he whispered. "Just hurts." "I know," Darian replied. "You didn't do anything wrong." From the back of the cabin, the boy recording zoomed in, capturing the way Darian held the blanket. The same blanket that had been refused. Now stained, now essential. The boy whispered as he filmed, "This is going viral." Corvin turned to face the window, shoulders sagging, his authority broken. The cabin, once fragmented by silence and etiquette, had found unity in truth. And as the minutes crawled forward, no one dared look away. The cabin now understood they were witnessing a man who had crossed a line he could never step back from. Corvin lunged forward, eyes wild, voice cracking as he shouted, "He tried to provoke me!" But no one moved to support him. The cabin was already in motion, not in panic, but in collective alertness. Darian Vale didn't flinch. His body pivoted with practiced precision, moving in front of Laron as instinct took over. Every movement around him slowed, like pieces of a chessboard tilting toward confrontation. Laron sat hunched, blood seeping between his fingers as he clutched the same blanket that had begun this entire spiral. The air was thick with disbelief and fury, the kind of silence that doesn't come from quiet, but from restraint. Darian's mind operated like a crisis console. Where were the nearest exits? How many phones were recording? Which passengers were seated? which were standing. Where was Corvin trying to go? Corvin stumbled backward, glancing toward the front of the plane as if he could vanish into the cockpit and escape consequence. Darian read the trajectory instantly. He raised his voice, not a shout, but a clear, firm command. "Don't let him near the galley." Two men reacted first. One, seated near the aisle with a green neck pillow still looped around his neck, stood and stepped forward. The second, tall and square-shouldered in a gray sweater, positioned himself by the tray cart. They didn't touch Corvin. They didn't need to. Their bodies, silent and steady, became a human blockade. Corvin's panic deepened. "You're not allowed to restrain crew," he barked, as though quoting policy would erase the punch, the blood, the shaking head of a teenager recording from 3 rows back. A boy near the rear lifted his phone high. "I've got everything," he called, voice cracking with emotion. 3 angles, full sound. His bravery triggered a ripple. Dozens of passengers raised their phones. Suddenly, the weight of witness was undeniable. Corvin backed into the drinks cart, nearly tipping it. Darian didn't blink. He stepped into the aisle, placing a steadying hand on the shoulder of the man in the green neck pillow. "Thank you," Darian said quietly, his voice sharp and cool. "Let's not let him retreat. Let's not let him rewrite what we all saw." Leron whimpered, not from fear, but from the throb of pain. The blanket had turned red at the nose, dark and soaking. Darian turned briefly, kneeling beside him. "Hold steady. I need your voice later." Leron nodded faintly, teeth gritted, breathing in short hisses through the cloth. Corvin, now surrounded, tried again to invoke authority. "You're passengers. This isn't your jurisdiction." Darian's eyes met his. Neither was striking a seated man. Dramatic irony thickened in the air. Corvin truly believed he still had command, but the cabin had shifted. The authority now pulsed through the quiet, decisive figure in the center aisle. Foreshadowing bloomed when a man near the front, dressed in casual business clothes with a lanyard peeking from his jacket, stood slowly. "I'm Arvin Castle," he said clearly, lifting his ID badge. "Off-duty safety inspector. I saw everything. This wasn't confusion. It was escalation. From him." Corvin turned pale. The passengers gasped, and the cabin shifted again, not in movement, but in allegiance. Darian gave a subtle nod to Arvin. No words were needed. The alliance had formed. Corvin's shoulders hunched. "No one's going to believe a mob over crew protocol," he muttered. From all sides, phones lifted again in eerie unison, like a courtroom without walls. Darian straightened, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. He walked forward slowly, his steps measured, his presence commanding. "They don't have to believe a mob," he said, voice low but audible to all. "They just have to believe the footage, and every second is already saved." The lights above flickered, turbulence rattling faintly as though mirroring the tension below. Still, Darian remained still, the eye of the storm. He turned back toward Leron, nodded once, then looked down the aisle at Corvin, who was now boxed in, outnumbered, and out of words. The cabin watched, waiting, no longer confused, but committed. Darian knew the real battle was about to begin, and he was ready for every part of it. The captain emerged from the cockpit just as the tension in the cabin began to curdle into something thick and dangerous. He didn't raise his voice or rush his steps. He merely stepped into the aisle and uttered a single phrase. "Everyone, please remain seated." But instead of calming the situation, the words dropped like a stone into a flood, pushing it further toward overflow. Gasps turned into mutters. The passengers didn't just hear indifference, they heard denial. And Darian Vale heard something else. A tactic. A stall. He stood up with deliberate precision, supporting his younger brother Leron, who was cradling his face beneath the now bloodied blanket that had been denied to him minutes earlier. Darian's hand remained steady, pressing the fabric to the bridge of Leron's swollen nose, but his mind sharpened into cold precision. The captain wasn't addressing the violence. He was addressing optics, deflection, control. Corvin Haldor, the flight attendant who had struck Laron, shifted behind the captain like a child seeking refuge behind a parent. His mouth moved rapidly. He started it. He was getting aggressive. I felt provoked. I had no choice. His voice carried just enough volume to be heard, but not enough to sound stable. Darien caught the slight glance the captain gave him, more precisely, the flicker toward the badge pinned to Darien's lapel. It was nothing flashy, just a silver-plated identifier of Arathon Systems' executive tier, but something about it made the captain uncomfortable. He clicked something in his ear, a tiny earpiece, and murmured, "We've got a situation. Need guidance from ground. Possibly hostile passenger engagement." His words were just low enough to be missed by most, but Darien noticed every syllable. Ground operations. Narrative control had begun. "Captain," Darien said, his voice calm but crystalline in its authority. "That man assaulted my brother, unprovoked, while seated. There are at least 10 different angles recorded. Emergency protocol requires medical aid and formal documentation. I suggest you initiate it now." The captain's brow twitched, a sheen of sweat beginning to form around his temples. "We have to assess the full context first. Emotions are high. I need cooperation from all sides." Darien didn't flinch. He slowly adjusted the blanket to reveal the spreading bruise beneath Laron's left eye and the thin line of blood still trickling from his nostril. Several passengers gasped audibly. A man in row 8 stood up and shouted, "Are you kidding? I filmed it. He didn't move. He just asked for a blanket." Another voice, further back, echoed, "I saw the whole thing." The attendant snapped before anyone said a word. Chatter became chorus. The captain raised both hands, trying to calm the rising tide of outrage, but the current had already turned. Darien didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every second that passed, he grew into the center of gravity inside that cabin. He met the captain's eyes and said, "Failure to follow protocol will be noted. I will personally ensure that a full federal report is submitted detailing this obstruction, your earpiece communication, and your refusal to act. I suggest you weigh your loyalty to crew against your duty to passenger safety." The captain's throat bobbed. His lips parted, but no words came out. Meanwhile, Corvin stood frozen, still gripping the service card handle as if it were a lifeline. His knuckles were white. He looked around for a shield, for anyone, anybody, who might speak in his defense, but all he saw were raised phones, steady hands, silent judgment. The very tools of control he once wielded, the aisle, the uniform, the cart, had become symbols of everything he was about to lose. A teenage boy near the emergency exit held up his phone. "Got it all," he said confidently. "Start to finish." The captain tried again, voice faltering. "We're doing our best to keep everyone safe." "No, Captain," Darien interrupted, voice iron beneath velvet. "Safety would have been preventing this, not covering it up. You have one final choice: act like a leader or become part of the problem." For a long, fragile moment, the cabin held still. The hum of the engines became louder by contrast, the cabin lights dimming slightly as turbulence bumped them from below. It felt as if the air itself was waiting for the captain's decision. Finally, the captain looked down. His voice barely audible, he turned toward the front of the plane and spoke into the comm. "Initiate emergency diversion. Nearest medical accessible airport. Notify ground security." A mix of relief and tension rippled through the cabin. Some passengers cheered quietly. Others just exhaled, as though they'd been holding their breath since Corvin's fist flew. But Darien didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. His hand remained steady against his brother's cheek, and his eyes stayed locked on the captain, not as a threat, but as a reminder that the balance of power had shifted. Corvin tried one last time to mutter an excuse. "No one will believe passengers over crew," he hissed. In answer, a dozen passengers lifted their phones silently, one after another, like a coordinated salute. The moment the captain met Darian's eyes, he understood that the flight was no longer under his control. Corvin's voice cracked through the cabin just as the captain's announcement ended, pacing in short, agitated circles near the service galley. "I followed procedure. I followed it to the letter," he repeated, louder each time as if volume might rewrite what had been witnessed. His face flushed with disbelief and panic. Corvin seemed to be talking to no one in particular, yet every word bounced against the pressurized silence of the cabin walls. He wasn't convincing anyone, especially not himself. Passengers murmured. Their eyes locked on him, some recording from over the tops of seatbacks, others just watching in stunned disbelief. The sharp smell of coffee from an overturned cart mingled with the sterile cabin air, and overhead lights flickered slightly as the plane adjusted altitude. In seat 4D, Darian Vale remained stone still, one hand securing the blood-soaked blanket over Laurent's nose, the other wrapped tightly around the armrest. His mind was already 5 steps ahead. He turned his head slightly and spoke without looking. "Sir, are you still filming?" he asked the teenager behind him. "Yes, sir," the boy replied immediately. "I've got 3 angles. Full audio." "Good," Darian nodded once coolly. "Keep it running. This will matter." Corvin's pacing turned erratic. His hands fluttered between gesturing and tugging at the hem of his uniform, and then suddenly to his ID badge, which he began twisting nervously. "I'm not the villain here," he shouted. "You all ganged up on me." His voice cracked again, higher this time. He pointed toward Laurent without looking. "He triggered me." The irony sat heavy in the air like cabin fog. The man who threw a punch was playing victim, surrounded by passengers who had not only seen but recorded everything. Darian remained calm. "Enough," he said quietly, not with force but with the unmistakable control of a man who meant every syllable. He turned slightly in his seat. "Corvin Haldor, sit down. You will remain still until authorities arrive. This is not a negotiation." Corvin froze for the briefest second. Then he laughed, a sharp, shallow scoff. "You think you can tell me?" "You assaulted a passenger in front of dozens of witnesses," Darian cut in, his voice gaining just enough volume to carry but never rising into a shout. "You're not a flight attendant right now. You're a liability. Sit down." Gasps rippled around the rows again, not from the threat, but from how cold and authoritative Darian sounded. It was the kind of voice that came not from anger, but from calculated certainty. Arven Castle stood quietly from his seat. "He's right," he said, flashing his inspector's ID just long enough for surrounding passengers to glimpse it. "And I'll be providing a full report of what I witnessed." Corvin faltered mid-step, suddenly processing the reality he had tried to outrun. "You?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "You were watching me the whole time?" "I watched you escalate a peaceful request into violence," Arven said plainly. "Now sit." Corvin stared at him, breathing shallow, chest rising and falling quickly as though he were weighing one final burst of defiance. But when Darian raised his hand, not to strike, but simply to steady the passengers who began standing to intervene, Corvin finally took 2 stiff steps backward and collapsed into the nearest jump seat, defeated but still seething. The cabin remained tense, like a stretched rubber band. Darian turned back toward Laurent, adjusting the blanket to keep pressure steady. Laurent blinked through the pane, his voice barely audible. Do you think this is going to ruin the meeting?" Darian met his brother's eyes. For a second his posture softened, but only slightly. "No. We'll deal with that later." "But the contract—" "Some things," Darian said quietly, "matter more." He squeezed Laren's shoulder once and looked up as the captain's voice crackled again over the intercom. "Cabin crew, prepare for emergency landing. Estimated touchdown at Vellum Ridge in 10 minutes. A few passengers cheered softly, but Darian didn't react. His eyes never left Corvin, whose muttering had returned, this time so low only the man next to him could hear. But Darien didn't need to hear the words. The descent had begun. Of the plane, of the cover-ups, of Corvin's career. Every moment was now part of a story being written by witness, video, and undeniable fact. The cabin lights dimmed into emergency glow, casting long streaks of amber across the seats, and the hum of the descent began to rise. The moment for panic had passed. Now came the stillness before impact, not of metal, but of consequence. Darien knew the descent would be short, but the consequences would last far longer than the flight itself. As the aircraft began its rapid descent, the overhead lights dimmed into safety mode, and the cabin transformed. Shadows stretched like dark fingers across the aisle, wavering with each small jolt of turbulence. In the low light, Darien Vale's face remained unreadable, stone-carved with discipline, yet alert with silent resolve. He adjusted a stack of pillows behind his brother Laurent's head, gently easing him into a safer angle. Laurent's breathing was shallow but steady. The blanket that had once been denied now cradled his nose, pressed tightly against the injury, the dried blood clinging to its folds like bruises on cloth. A faint click buzzed on Darien's encrypted wristwatch. He turned it slightly to read the message that blinked back at him. Ground unit notified, awaiting confirmation. He didn't smile. He didn't relax. His objective had shifted yet again. Prevent interference before the truth could land with them. Across the aisle, Corvin Haldor had begun to unravel. First came the mutters, quiet, broken fragments to no one in particular. They twisted it. They made it look wrong. Then came the shifting in his seat, his fingers twitching as if replaying the strike, unsure if it had happened seconds or lifetimes ago. I didn't mean to snap. They pushed me. His eyes darted about the cabin, stopping on every phone, every passenger, as if counting the witnesses he might one day need to discredit. Darien didn't engage. He remained seated, angled just enough to protect Laurent while keeping Corvin in full view. The air around them was tight with pressure, the silence more tense than any shouting would have been. "You all saw it," Corvin suddenly barked. "You don't understand what we go through. You think we're robots?" His voice cracked. No one answered. From 2 rows ahead, Arvin Castle, the off-duty transport inspector who had kept silent until now, stood and walked slowly toward Darien. He leaned in, his voice low but steady. "I'll give my statement the second we land. Every word." His eyes flicked toward Corvin. "He's done this before. Just never like this." Darien gave a small nod. "Then we finish it properly." A jolt hit the aircraft, light turbulence but enough to prompt the captain to issue a sharp warning over the intercom. All passengers remain seated. Secure all items. His voice trembled at the edges. He knew what awaited him, too, but the captain's voice was just background noise now. In the back rows, passengers whispered. Some reviewed videos, narrating timestamps. One young man said, "I got the hit from 2 angles. You can even see the blood hit the seat in slow-mo." Another confirmed Corvin's earlier aggression with a clip from takeoff. The story was already forming, piece by piece, phone by phone, witness by witness. And then came the twist. Without warning, Corvin jerked forward, unbuckling his belt and trying to rise. His eyes were wild with desperation. "I need to speak to the captain before landing. He has to understand what happened." "No," Darien said calmly, not moving. "I have to." Corvin lunged 2 steps toward the aisle. But Darien was faster. With a simple gesture, he signaled 2 men nearby. One was tall with broad shoulders, the other shorter but built like a tank. They rose almost in sync, not grabbing Corvin, but stepping into the aisle with practiced ease, blocking his path like twin sentinels. Corvin skidded to a stop. "Let me through," he demanded, panic lacing his voice. The tall man shook his head. "You're not going anywhere." Corvin looked around, suddenly aware that the entire cabin had turned against him. He sagged back into his seat, collapsing as if the weight of exposure had crushed his spine. His breathing became shallow, hands fidgeting with the seams of his uniform. Darien didn't speak again. He turned his attention back to Laurent, who had opened his eyes just enough to speak through the blanket. "Is this going to ruin the Renford meeting?" Laurent asked, voice thick with pain but lined with concern. Darien held the boy's gaze for a moment before replying. "Some things matter more." The descent felt like the longest chapter of their journey, even though it took only minutes. He laughed, confident in his authority, unaware that every passenger, every witness, and every object around him had been silently noting the moment of abuse. If you believe arrogance under a uniform always meets immediate retribution, hit subscribe now, because justice never forgets. The landing gear struck the runway with a thunderous jolt, sending a deep vibration through the cabin as overhead bins rattled and passengers instinctively braced themselves. The emergency strobes flared outside the windows, casting rhythmic flashes across tense faces. Darien Vale didn't flinch. He remained seated, shoulders squared, eyes fixed ahead, but his mind was already racing. Laurent, beside him, gripped the bloodied blanket tighter. Each tremor of the slowing aircraft made his injured nose throb, and the dried edges of crimson fabric now clung to his skin. He exhaled shakily, but Darien placed a steadying hand on his arm, silent but anchoring. Every second mattered now. Then came the captain's voice, hollow and too calm over the intercom. "Authorities will be boarding shortly due to a minor passenger disturbance. Please remain seated." The words echoed like a betrayal across the cabin. A ripple of indignation shot through the passengers. Murmurs turned into sharp objections. "Disturbance," someone barked from the mid-cabin. "That man was punched," said another. A third passenger raised his phone, still recording. "Tell the truth," came a shout from the rear. Darien didn't join in, not yet. Instead, he raised a hand, palm outward, signaling for quiet. His gesture held weight. The cabin fell silent again, but this time it was not compliance, it was calculation. Darien turned slightly to Arvin Castle, the off-duty safety inspector 2 rows ahead. Arvin leaned over the aisle and whispered, "They may try to spin it before the feds step in. It's not over yet." His tone carried urgency. Darien gave the slightest nod, already assembling the plan. The plane came to a full stop. The soft whir of cabin air faded into silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the intercom cutting out. Then the door opened. In stepped 2 airport security officers, followed closely by a pair of federal transport agents in dark vests. Their presence changed the air. It wasn't just authority, they brought judgment, the kind that came with pens, cameras, and the power to end careers. Corvin Haldor, still seated in the front jump seat, went rigid. His shoulders jerked upright and he stared forward as if holding still might render him invisible. But it was too late for invisibility. One of the agents scanned the aisle. The officers began formally taking statements from passengers. Darien stepped inside briefly, offering structure where fear had once lingered. "You saw what happened," he said to a man near the galley who had recorded the initial denial and argument. "Please share that video with the investigators. Every detail matters." The man nodded quickly. "Already did," he said. "Sent it to the email they gave us." Nearby, Corvin slumped into a seat, sweat soaking through his uniform collar. His voice turned from sharp denial to desperate confusion. "It was a setup. I swear someone wanted me to fail." But no one listened. The truth wasn't in his words anymore. It was in the footage, in the blood, in the bruised silence of a cabin united by what they'd witnessed. The aircraft door remained open, a metal threshold between conflict and justice. As Darien stepped out again to check on Laurent's condition, he noticed the captain trying to slip unnoticed toward the cockpit. An officer caught him just in time, placing a hand on his chest. "You'll stay here until your statement is complete." The captain offered no resistance but kept his eyes on the ground, unable to meet Darien's gaze. Darian walked toward the ambulance where Laurent was now seated upright, nose bandaged. "It's not broken beyond repair," one of the medics told him, "but he'll need a full reset, some bruising, maybe a minor fracture." Laurent nodded slowly. "I'm okay," he whispered through swollen lips, voice muffled by pain and gauze. "Just hurts to breathe through it." Darian didn't smile. Instead, he reached for the edge of the blanket and adjusted it gently around his brother's shoulders, not as a gesture of warmth, but of quiet reassurance. A symbol that what began as neglect would now end in accountability. Behind them, the aircraft loomed like a shadow of everything broken. Inside, the story was no longer being told. It was being dissected. Darian turned slightly, watching the last few passengers give their statements as the agents continued their interviews. Every word added another stone to the structure he was building, one built not from emotion, but from evidence. No theatrics, no vengeance, just cold, sharp truth. The wind picked up slightly. Laurent shivered beneath the blanket. Darian didn't flinch. He simply placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, anchoring him, anchoring both of them. The blanket, stained and torn, rests across Laurent's chest like a quiet reminder of what sparked the storm. Darian knew that the landing was only the midpoint of a much larger fight waiting beyond the runway. The footage paused on the exact frame when Corvin Haldor's fist connected with Laren Vale's nose. The agents in the secure investigation lounge didn't speak at first. The silence was dense, not of indifference but analysis, each of them studying the clip with the focus of someone who had seen too many excuses before. The screen showed the sharp angle of impact, the shock flooding Laurent's face, and the immediate chaos that followed. Darian sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight, watching not just the footage, but the faces of the investigators. He wasn't gauging empathy, he was gauging readiness. His objective had evolved beyond protecting Laurent. Now he intended to root out every flaw in the system that allowed a man like Corvin to still wear a uniform. "The impact is clear," one agent muttered, voice low, nearly reverent with disgust. "Multiple angles," another added, "no ambiguity." Just as the third reached for the remote to replay a different view, the captain pushed through the door. "Gentlemen," he began quickly, "I understand tensions were high, but the crew's mental state should be—" "We're reviewing evidence," one of the lead agents cut him off flatly, not even looking up. "But context," the captain pressed, face tight, fingers twitching near his belt. "Will be taken from actual behavior," the agent said, raising the volume just slightly, "not speculative excuses." The room returned to silence. Darian said nothing. He didn't need to. The agents had seen what mattered. Still, the captain lingered, his body half turned toward the screen. Eyes flicking uneasily between Darian and the footage paused in judgment. Then the door opened again. Laurent entered slowly, guided by a male technician. His nose was freshly bandaged, the skin around his eyes puffed and red. The blanket, the same one that sparked everything, was still draped over his shoulders. He looked like someone carrying both pain and proof. Darian rose to steady his brother. Laurent didn't say much, he didn't need to, but his presence shifted the room's temperature. The agents adjusted their seats slightly, aware that the victim was not a statistic, but a person, alive and still bleeding beneath gauze. Then came the next crack in the facade. "Agent Parlin," said a younger officer entering with a tablet, "you're going to want to see this." Parlin took the device and scrolled, his eyebrows tightening. "The airline's incident log shows Corvin had 3 previous complaints for aggressive conduct," he said. "All cleared." "By whom?" Darian asked, already knowing. Parlin looked up. Harvin Coldren. The name hung in the air like smoke, dense, toxic, undeniable. Darian slowly sat back, his face unreadable, though his fingers curled ever so slightly. Harvin Coldren. a senior supervisor with a reputation for shielding volatile staff under the banner of loyalty. Darien had dealt with men like him in boardrooms, men who thought protection was a strategy, not a flaw. As the agents exchanged looks, one of the uniformed security officers stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, but his voice was careful. "There's more. Before the landing, the captain here," he gestured toward the man still standing awkwardly near the door, "attempted to radio in a false report, classified the entire event as a passenger altercation, left out the assault. We pulled the transmission logs." Darien didn't flinch, but the captain did. He opened his mouth as if to defend himself, but nothing came out. One of the agents shook his head slowly, making a quiet note. The betrayal was layered. Crew defending crew, supervisors suppressing reports, false narratives being prepared before wheels touched ground. And yet they had all miscalculated the presence of a calm, calculating man who had already anticipated the storm. "Mr. Vale," Agent Parlin asked, "do you believe this incident is isolated?" "No," Darien replied. "I believe it's the product of a shielded pattern. You're not just looking at one man's outburst. You're looking at a structure that feeds denial." Laron shifted slightly beside him, the blanket slipping just enough to reveal the dried blood at the collar of his shirt. Darien looked at his brother. "We're not leaving this room with a story that stops at one man's bad day." The hallway outside buzzed with low voices, passengers giving statements, voices of unity rising like testimony. One by one, people who had been strangers hours ago now stood in quiet defiance of a system they saw exposed. Then came a final whisper. Laron leaned toward his brother, eyes steady despite the bruising. "I want justice," he said quietly. "Not just for me. For anyone he's done this to before." Darien nodded once. Not slowly, not dramatically, but with the precision of a man setting a course. The real battle was shifting from the cabin to the system that allowed such men to keep their positions. The door closed with a soft, mechanical click behind them as Darien and Laron were led into the private briefing room. No one smiled. The air was thick with unease, and the agents who had escorted them in moved with the precision of men who had already seen too much and knew they would see more before the day ended. One of them, Agent Marrow, adjusted his tie and gestured toward two chairs set before a monitor already cued with paused footage. Laron eased down slowly, the pressure bandage still firm across his nose. Darien remained standing for a moment, surveying the room. Frosted windows, wall-mounted screens, an untouched carafe of coffee in the corner, and a clipboard resting on the table like a loaded weapon. Agent Vey, taller and older than the others, stepped forward and pressed play. The screen came to life with sharp clarity. A passenger's phone camera had captured everything. Corvin Haldor standing over Laron, the raised hand, the quick, brutal strike, the moment of impact. Blood, silence, gasps. "He claimed he tripped," Vey said quietly, pausing the footage just after the hit. His tone was dry, almost numb. Darien slowly sat down, folding his hands in front of him. "And you believed that?" "No," Marrow replied, shaking his head. "But it's protocol. Every claim has to be recorded, no matter how absurd." Laron didn't speak. His eyes remained locked on the monitor, as if replaying the blow in his mind on loop. The blanket, now freshly cleaned but still carrying the weight of what had happened, was folded in his lap like a silent witness. "Supervisor Harvin Coldren," Vey continued, flipping through a thin file, "approved Corvin's presence on this flight. He also cleared 3 internal complaints against Corvin in the last 18 months. Darien's eyes narrowed. "Is he here?" Marrow exhaled. "He's gone. His work phone's off. No one's answering at his residence. His badge was used to exit the main facility less than an hour after your aircraft touched down." The implication hung in the air. Not just negligence, foresight, escape. "Then he knew this was coming," Darien said, voice like polished glass. Vey didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened a confidential packet and slid a few pages across the table. Off-duty Inspector Arvin Castle submitted this just before you arrived. It includes a training roster for mandatory behavioral recertifications. Corvin's name was on it 3 months ago. Laron looked over, brow furrowed under the bandage. So, he wasn't trained. He was scheduled, Vey confirmed, but Coldren signed a removal order. No justification attached. Darien leaned back slowly, his mind aligning the puzzle pieces. Then this wasn't a mistake. This was engineered neglect. A man known to be unstable, protected and deployed like a pawn no one expected to snap in public. Dramatic irony coiled like smoke around the room. Darien had boarded that flight hoping only to protect his brother's peace and secure a historic contract. Now, he sat at the center of a corruption spiral that went deeper than one man's violent temper. Voices filtered in faintly from the hallway. Witnesses. Passengers offering statements. Some chose to stay longer, lingering in case they were needed again. Support had shifted from sympathy to alliance. "I was asked earlier," Darien said, his tone measured and clear, "if I plan to press charges." Vey looked up from his file, listening. "I'm not interested in retaliation," Darien continued. "I'm interested in resolution. I intend to pursue whatever ensures full accountability." His words didn't rise or tremble, but their precision struck the table like a gavel. Laron turned toward him, silent for a long moment. Then, with quiet pride softening the tight line of his mouth, he nodded once. "I knew you'd handle this." Behind them, the door buzzed faintly as another agent opened it to escort the next round of witnesses. Inside the room, the energy shifted. What began as a reaction to violence had become the spark of reform. Darien's eyes drifted back to the paused image on the monitor. Corvin, mid-strike, frozen forever in evidence. Not just of an assault, but of a system that allowed it to happen. The agents realized this was no longer a routine investigation. It was the beginning of something larger, something structural. The hearing room erupted the moment the video was played. Corvin Haldor's face filled the screen, frozen mid-laugh just seconds before his fist struck Laren Vale's nose. The footage was undeniable. Clear audio, clean angle, and time-stamped from 3 separate passenger devices. The claim of extreme stress that the airline's attorney had confidently opened with now collapsed in real time, cracking under the weight of recorded truth. A murmur rolled through the gallery like a rising tide, and even the airline's own representatives shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable. Corvin, seated at the far end of the room behind his counsel, stared at the table, his fingers twitching slightly, his shoulders rigid. Darien Vale didn't blink. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady, his suit immaculate, and began to speak. "I'll walk you through the sequence," Darien said, his voice low but commanding, the cadence practiced yet unscripted. At 8:12 a.m., my brother Laron requested a blanket, politely. Corvin Haldor dismissed him without explanation. At 8:15, after a second request, Mr. Haldor responded with open hostility, including verbal accusations of provocation. At 8:18, he punched my brother in the face while Laron was seated. At no point did Laron threaten, escalate, or challenge Mr. Haldor in a manner that justified physical assault. He paused. All eyes were on him. Even the judge, a thick-browed man named Joran Kell, leaned slightly forward, pen resting on his pad without moving. "We have 12 witness statements, 3 independent video recordings, 1 off-duty inspector's testimony, and a trail of internal negligence that empowered Mr. Haldor's aggression." The airline's attorney tried to interject but was swiftly silenced by Judge Kell's raised hand. "We'll let Mr. Vale finish," the judge said. "Where is the injured party?" he asked, voice low and clear. Darien stood. He didn't rush, didn't grandstand. He simply rose, blanket still pressed gently to Laurent's face. With calm precision, he turned to the agents, peeled back the edge of the fabric, and revealed the damage. Laurent's nose was swollen and crusted with dried blood. A dark red line streaked from nostril to chin, and his lip had begun to split under the pressure of the impact. The younger man winced, but didn't speak. His silence, his pain, said enough. The agents exchanged glances. One scribbled into a notepad while the other stepped forward. The lead officer turned his attention to the front of the plane. Flight Attendant Haldor, remain seated. Corvin's voice cracked as he tried to stand. This is being blown out of proportion. There's context. He threatened me. No, said a man 3 rows back, standing and holding his phone. We all saw it. He asked for a blanket. Several others rose. Phones were raised again and again like torches in the dark. He hit a passenger, one man said. He's lying, another added. We have it on video, a teenager called out. The captain, still standing near the cockpit, tried once more. There are details you need to consider. My crew was under. Captain, the agent interrupted sharply. We'll review everything. Sit down. The captain hesitated. His lips parted, searching for another excuse. But when he glanced around the cabin and saw the passengers aligned, each one staring with disbelief and contempt, he said nothing and retreated to the cockpit. Corvin, now visibly shaking, slumped into his seat. His hands trembled as he tried to adjust his name badge, as if some insignia might protect him. He opened his mouth again, but the lead agent raised a hand. Not another word. A hush fell again. The agents turned to Darien. We'll begin taking formal statements shortly, one said. Darien nodded and sat back down beside Laurent, who leaned against his shoulder with exhausted relief. For the first time since boarding, Darien felt the weight of justice shift toward the truth. The video footage played without mercy. Corvin Haldor stood in the center of the small aisle, cornered by silence and the unwavering gaze of the federal officers. The passenger's phone screen cast a cold light across his face as the exact moment his fist connected with Laurent's nose played out again, frame by frame. No sound in the room dared interrupt it. Even Corvin's breathing stilled as the damning evidence looped once more. When it ended, the silence didn't offer him shelter. It only made the truth louder. Across the cabin, Darien Vale remained composed, but his mind worked with the precision of a tactical mapmaker. The incident had shifted his mission from calm transport to structured accountability. He moved through the chaos with purpose, instructing passengers one by one. Stay calm. If you recorded it, please save the file and keep your phone unlocked. We'll need clear timelines and statements. His voice was soft but firm, authoritative without alarm, the kind of leadership that didn't demand attention. It earned it. Outside, the blur of ambulance lights painted red streaks across the tarmac. Medics loaded Laurent onto a stretcher, his body hunched slightly but his grip tight on the very blanket that had triggered the confrontation. It covered his chest now, stained with blood, turned from comfort to evidence. Darien followed at a distance, standing just outside the aircraft door as Laurent was guided down the metal stairs to the waiting medical crew. The air outside was crisp, bracing. Darien inhaled slowly, letting the cold center him. Inside, tension didn't loosen. Corvin had begun to tremble, not from regret, but from the dawning realization that the narrative he hoped to control was now slipping beyond reach. He stammered to one of the officers. It wasn't like that. I felt cornered. I didn't know what he was going to do. He raised his hands, but the officer didn't flinch. The man was seated. No signs of threat. The video speaks for itself. At the rear of the aircraft, Darien's thoughts sharpened as a quiet voice joined him. Arvin Castle, the off-duty safety inspector. His face was pale, but his tone steady. This wasn't the first time, he muttered. Corvin's had complaints. Aggressive behavior, reports swept under the rug. But this is the first time he hit someone. Darien turned his full attention to the man. Dismissed reports? he asked, already calculating. 3 that I know of, Arvin confirmed, glancing back toward the chaos inside. Each one vanished from the records before making it to disciplinary review. Darian didn't answer immediately. His silence stretched long enough to be deliberate. The pattern was forming. This was not the case of one man snapping. It was the fruit of a system that had learned to protect itself by suppressing accountability. And now it had bled. The tension in the room tightened further when investigator Marin Dorr stood to speak. He adjusted his tie, flipped open a folder, and turned to address the court. Overnight file recovery from the airline's internal complaint portal revealed 6 separate complaints involving Mr. Haldor's behavior over the last 18 months. All were rerouted. None reached formal review channels. The rerouting was done manually by one individual. All traces led back to a supervisor, Harvin Coldren. A jolt passed through the courtroom. The airline's legal team exchanged hushed whispers. Coldren's name hadn't been officially revealed until this moment. Darian's gaze sharpened. He had suspected Coldren's involvement since the moment Inspector Arvin Castle mentioned it in passing the night before. But hearing it confirmed by federal investigators gave the revelation the impact it deserved. It gets worse, Dorr continued. Earlier this morning, we conducted a search of Mr. Haldor's crew locker. Inside, we discovered a second phone, encrypted, unregistered. After unlocking it, our team uncovered direct messages from Harvin Coldren. They include phrases such as, "Don't let passengers undermine your authority," and, most concerning, "Control the situation early. Don't tolerate pressure." A visible wave of anger swept through the gallery. One passenger, seated in the row behind Darian, whispered, "So, it was planned." Judge Kell didn't silence him. He let the silence sit instead, let it weigh. Darian looked over at his brother. Leron sat quietly, a clean white bandage across his nose, the same gray-blue blanket folded neatly across his lap. He didn't flinch, didn't frown. He just watched. He had become more than a victim. He was now a symbol of a system that failed the very people it promised to protect. The airline's attorney stood again, desperate now. "We acknowledge the footage. However, emotional stress, particularly at altitude, can sometimes lead to momentary lapses in judgment. Mr. Haldor—" "Laughed," said a man in the back. The voice cut through like a blade. It was Kellen Marich, the teenager who'd recorded the footage. He stood unprompted and held his phone up. "I have more." Right before the punch, Corvin smiled. He made a joke under his breath. He wasn't scared. He was enjoying it. Judge Kell turned to the gallery. "Will you submit that footage to the record?" "Yes, sir," Kellen said firmly. Silence returned, but it wasn't passive anymore. It was a silent judgment forming in real time. A different investigator rose now. "There is sufficient evidence here to suggest systemic manipulation within the airline's crew supervision protocol. Corvin Haldor may have acted physically, but the signals he followed were given from above him." Darian remained seated, his hands folded together tightly on the table in front of him. He wasn't smiling. There was no triumph in his posture. This wasn't about winning. It was about exposing a chain of failures that began with a single blanket request and ended in criminal negligence. Outside the hearing chamber, reporters pressed against glass walls. Microphones, notepads, cameras. The weight of what was being said inside this hall had already started to leak. One final revelation landed like thunder. An agent entered mid-hearing and handed a slip of paper to the lead investigator. After scanning it quickly, the man cleared his throat and addressed the room. "Harvin Coldren is no longer responding to communications. His office was found locked this morning. Early security footage shows him removing files and departing company grounds at 4:13 a.m. He is now considered a person of interest in the obstruction of federal oversight." No one spoke for several seconds. Darian inhaled, slow and deep. His brother's hand, still resting lightly atop the blanket, closed into a quiet fist. The hearing officer finally nodded and adjourned the session. stating that formal charges would be considered pending review of the new evidence. As the room emptied, one detail remained unchanged. Laurent still held that blanket. It had started as a simple comfort request and ended up as the physical centerpiece of a scandal. A piece of fabric, now heavy with meaning, carried like a quiet flag of both injury and resolve. And as Darian helped Laurent stand, neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. The hearing ended with the realization that the assault was a symptom of a much deeper poison in the airline's leadership. The verdict struck like the crack of thunder in a courtroom silenced by anticipation. Corvin Haldor is hereby permanently banned from all aviation employment and will face criminal charges for aggravated assault aboard a commercial aircraft. The words echoed across the polished stone walls of the Vellum Ridge Transport Authority briefing hall, and, for a moment, it seemed even the microphones hesitated, reverberating the weight of that announcement. The room, crowded with officials, legal representatives, press, and quiet onlookers, held its collective breath as the rest of the ruling unfolded. Harvin Coldren, once an untouchable figure in operations at Meridian Sky, was arrested the night before for evidence suppression, obstruction of regulatory proceedings, and for knowingly enabling behavioral patterns that endangered the safety of passengers. He had been taken into custody while attempting to board a private charter out of Gelen Airport. Investigators found an unregistered communications device and several unsigned termination letters in his luggage, documents never filed but clearly intended to silence whistleblowers. The drama had expanded from the cabin of Flight 904 to the top floor of the airline's inner sanctum, and now justice was beginning to reach the highest rungs. Darian Vale sat beside his younger brother Laurent at the back of the hall, out of the camera's range. Laurent's nose was fully healed, the bandages gone, replaced now with nothing but a faint line of redness under his right eye. Resting across his lap, folded with delicate precision, was the very blanket Corvin had once refused him, the same one used to stop the bleeding. Clean now, it bore no trace of the violence, yet it had become something more than fabric. It was testimony. Silent, but undeniable. The captain of Flight 904 was also named during the ruling. Suspended for falsifying in-flight reports and failure to uphold federal transport disclosure standards, he had submitted a post-flight summary labeling the incident a passenger-provoked confrontation, a lie uncovered through time-stamped footage and corroborated testimony. The moment his name was read, murmurs swept the room, proof that silence in the face of injustice wasn't neutrality. It was complicity. A few rows forward, the CEO of Meridian Sky fidgeted as a reporter stood and asked him directly, "Will you take responsibility for your airline's role in these repeated oversights?" The cameras panned toward him, but his answer came with a flat tone, eyes downcast. "We deeply regret the distress caused and are working to ensure such incidents do not occur again." It was an apology, technically, but even to those far from the podium, it sounded more like the reading of a script than the voice of remorse. Darian watched, expression unreadable, his thoughts not on the man's words but on the pattern he represented. Then came the announcement that changed everything. "We hereby confirm the introduction of a new national mandate, the Vale Passenger Integrity Standard, based on the evidence and policy recommendations submitted during this investigation," the lead agent declared, lifting a folder marked with the crest of the National Aviation Integrity Commission. "This policy will introduce tiered crew evaluations, require open access to passenger complaints, and enforce quarterly de-escalation training for all flight staff. All airlines operating under federal charter are expected to comply within 90 days. The name stunned the room into momentary silence. The Vale Passenger Integrity Standard. Laurent turned his head slowly toward his brother, disbelief flickering in his gaze. Darian didn't react outwardly, but his hand moved to Laren's shoulder with quiet certainty, a grounding gesture that said, "This wasn't about fame or ego. This was about something lasting." Outside the hall, a crowd had gathered holding signs both in protest and support. Some bore phrases like "Passenger Rights Matter" and "No More Cover-Ups." A few even held up hand-drawn blankets in symbolic solidarity. The irony wasn't lost on Darien, how something so basic, so small, had become a symbol strong enough to reshape federal policy. As reporters shouted questions, "Mr. Vale, do you plan to sue the airline? Leron, what message do you have for passengers? Will you be taking legal action against the captain?" The brothers did not stop. They moved through the corridor slowly but firmly, ignoring the flash of cameras, the stretch of microphones, the calls from people who had just now begun to understand the scale of what had happened. "I'm glad it's over," Leron murmured as they exited onto the courthouse steps. Darien didn't answer right away. He looked up at the sky, crisp, blue, cloudless, so different from the pressurized walls of the cabin that started it all. Then he glanced back at the blanket in his brother's arms, a faint crease running along its center from where it had once been clenched between shaking fingers. "It's not over," he said quietly, voice steady. "But now, it's built into something that will outlast us." And then, without turning back to the crowd behind them, without waiting for headlines or applause, the two brothers walked away. The blanket that began as a simple request ended as a symbol of reform that would protect millions of future passengers. He struck the brother and froze when the very blanket he denied became the tool to wrap his broken nose, exposing his cowardice. If you believe true authority, disclaimer, the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, abuse of authority, and the power of composure and strategic action when confronting prejudice. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and treating every passenger with dignity and respect.